Good afternoon. How is everyone? Well, thank you so much for having me. It really is such a treat to be here. I really don't want to take too much time talking at you. I would love to make this a conversation, but to set the stage, I thought it may be good to give you a little bit of my background, some of the issues that we are talking about on the campaign trail, but really want to provide a little bit of time for some Q&A. So, as mentioned, my name is Krish. It's basically Trish with a K. My last name is Vignarajah, but honestly, my husband sometimes says, you know, my middle name is O'Mara, his last name. And he's like, Krish O'Mara would be a little bit easier on the campaign trail. I try to make it even easier than that. You just need to remember Krish. I'm trying to become Madonna or Prince, depending on who you prefer better. So I was 9 months old when my parents fled a civil war and came to America and Maryland. Both of my parents became Baltimore City public school teachers, and they built a life here in Maryland that made my life going from Woodlawn High to the White House possible. I served in the Obama administration for 5 years. I was Michelle Obama's policy director at the White House, honor of a lifetime, had the also honor of a lifetime to serve as senior advisor to Hillary Clinton and John Kerry at the State Department, where I helped manage a $51.6 billion budget, ran multi-billion-dollar initiatives out of the White House, and before I joined the administration, I had been a lawyer as well as in business. I realized that in no other place in this world is my life story possible, and that is in many ways why I decided to run. I remember November 9th walking back into the White House under a slate gray sky and this appropriate drizzle, and Michelle Obama came by my office and we talked about the fact that progress is not linear. Part of why I think November 2016 happened was because there was a complacency. And while I know we will never say thank goodness Donald Trump was elected, I think we certainly have been shaken from that complacency. And what I have seen as I have been crisscrossing the state tirelessly is an enthusiasm of our electorate that I have never seen before. And that's where I think that we have an opportunity. I try to avoid the labels because I think they're actually very destructive in politics. But the shorthand way in which I would describe myself is fiscally responsible, socially progressive. I think there are a lot of people out there who feel like there is a moderate majority that feels like neither party truly represents them. And that is actually why I decided to run. I was in Western Maryland, I saw the straw poll of the 8 men who at that point were running, and I realized that none of them, in many different respects, represented me and a lot of people I knew. So that's where I realized that while I have been called Donald Trump's worst nightmare in article after article, it is in many ways my badge of honor. I know we cannot win by simply being anti-Trump and anti-Hogan. But I think we can if we put forth a positive, affirmative agenda of what we can accomplish. For me, that is focused on 4 areas: education, revitalizing our economy, protecting our environment, supporting working families. Happy to go into kind of a greater level of detail, but let me give you kind of a couple nuggets on each of those areas. Education is why I'm running for governor. There's a reason why I've been called the education candidate. I'm the only candidate in the field who is the product of Maryland Public Schools from kindergarten through 12th grade, only candidate who is running with a lifelong teacher and president of the Baltimore Teachers Union, only candidate, as I mentioned, who is the product from kindergarten through 12th grade. It is my life story. And I know that we have to invest. It's why we put forth a comprehensive policy from cradle to career, investing in universal pre-K, fully funding and rebuilding our crumbling schools, making sure that every child has hot and healthy breakfasts and lunches, knowing that we all know common sense, no child can give their teacher their full attention on an empty stomach. But also knowing that our schools, whether here in Harford County, whether in Baltimore City, where I just came from, have become community centers because the truth is, twice as many Maryland students live in poverty today as did in 1990. And that's where, you know, my father would be the first one to tell you, our schools have to become community centers to help support these children. But we also have to make sure that when our children that we invest in science, technology, engineering, arts, math, financial literacy, and civics education, that we stop teaching for the test and we start treating our teachers as the professionals they are. That when our kids come out of school, that they are either career ready, meaning that they are ready for the trades or other professions, or college ready. And it's why we have proposed free community college as well as debt-free tuition for our HBCUs. Because I want to make sure that our children are prepared, whether they do decide to become a plumber or a pipe fitter or a welder or an electrician, or if they want to pursue a 2 or 4-year college, that it is not financing that stands in the way. When it comes to the economy, we know we have to invest in infrastructure. We have to recognize that, I used to take the MARC train, the Penn line, that obviously came up to Aberdeen and Perryville, but we need to extend it. We need to go to the University of Delaware in Newark. We need to recognize that if we don't invest in our infrastructure, we are throttling our economy. We have to recognize that we have incredible assets like Aberdeen Proving Grounds, where actually both of my parents taught at varying points, worked at varying points in their career. Knowing that we're not leveraging the human talent that we have, we're not leveraging the federal facilities, the world-class universities, that we aren't leveraging the human talent that we have. But likewise, that we're not supporting small businesses. I always say, if Democrats are going to be the party of the working class, we've got to be the party of small businesses. We've got to recognize that we have high costs of living, we have a high tax structure, and as a result, it is leading people and businesses to vote with their feet and move to Delaware and move to Virginia. We are becoming less competitive, and we need to recognize that and address the fact that there are ways in which we can course correct. Third, when it comes to the environment, we have incredible natural resources. The Chesapeake Bay is a great example. But when we look at the fact that if we look further north to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, 21% of the pollution that ends up in the bay is coming from that one county, right? This is where we have to recognize that if we want to protect and restore the bay, we have to address the tributaries that feed into it. But we also have to make sure that we invest in clean energy, because Maryland consumes more energy than it produces, which means that we're exporting our dollars and importing air pollution, which is actually literally killing our population. We have the worst number of deaths due to air pollution of any state in the nation. But we also have to invest in our outdoor economy. We all know we have some of the most beautiful, pristine natural resources in the nation. I want to make sure that every single Marylander and non-Marylander recognizes that fact. When I was at the State Department, part of my responsibility was called economic statecraft. It's just what we basically promoted American businesses, but also promoted tourism. In our state, tourism is the second biggest part of our economy. But we need to make sure that we are marketing our natural resources, that we're investing in access to our natural resources in terms of hiking trails, pier launches. Those are the sorts of things and ways in which we can grow our economy. And then finally, working families. One of the first policies I would announce was making sure that we guarantee 3 months of paid family leave. Because we know that the US is the only developed democracy in the world that doesn't guarantee paid family leave. Which means we put our parents in the position of having to choose between taking care of their child and putting food on the table. We know that children are raised healthier and more active. We know that the parents return more productive, and we know that businesses are able to more often recruit and retain talent. But likewise, whether I am in Western Maryland, Northern Maryland, Southern Maryland, the Eastern Shore, time and time again I talk about healthcare because it is bankrupting our families. And look, I came out of the Obama administration. The ACA was an important step forward, but the job is not done. And that's where we have to recognize the premiums remain high, that people are burdened by medical bills. My parents are now 81 and 80, and I can tell you that whatever ailment you want to talk about, my father or mother have it. And this is where, we've gotten to the position where I am starting to patrol, police, doctor my parents. And this is where, when I think about how much we pay for prescriptions, you realize that the governor can play a role in this, and yet time and time again, we have a governor who has failed to show leadership. And that's where we have an opportunity. Oftentimes people say to me, he's not so bad. And I realize that mediocrity in Maryland is not what we need. And the conventional wisdom out there is that no man can beat Larry Hogan. Well, and that's where I do think that we have an opportunity, because if you look at election after election this year, you have seen the success of women. Just last Tuesday, 84% of the women who ran won. We've seen that in terms of beating incumbents, 61% of those pickup opportunities have been won by women. And so when I selected another woman to run on my ticket, Sharon Blake, a lifelong teacher, as I mentioned, president of the Baltimore Community Teachers Union, there were some number of people who said to me, well, I don't know, an all-woman ticket, and especially an all-woman of color ticket. I said, how many times have we had the exact opposite? And has anyone ever complained? And this is where when you realize that out of 14 federal and statewide offices, 8 congressmen, 2 senators, the attorney general, comptroller, lieutenant governor, and governor, all 14 of those positions are filled by men. You realize that there is an opportunity. And this is where, for me, it's not just about representation, it's about policy. It's about the fact that we come in 50th out of 50 when it comes to child care subsidies. It's about the fact that as of this last legislative session, we were still debating rapists having paternity rights. Maryland being one of the 6 states that had allowed for this. This is where that lack of diversity matters. And this is where we do have a moment. But in order for it to be long-standing and historic, I need your help to make it a movement. How many people here participated in the Women's March? How many people here participated in the Climate March? The Science March? March for Our Lives? Okay, so I hope that when I ask... The Unity March, thank you. I feel like there's many others, Black Lives Matter. This is where what we are seeing in America is magical. It is a moment that I am not sure we will ever see again. But what I need your help to do, because we have won debate after debate, literally straw poll after straw poll, every single one in the last 2 months. But we need to continue to build that movement, because there are still some folks out there that have never heard a name that they can't pronounce. But what I will tell you is if they hear the message, it's a winning one. And so anything you could do to help us, I would appreciate it, because I know we can win. And this is where I do think that we have an opportunity. I appreciate you having me and look forward to taking your questions. Thank you so much.
What your plan is, should you win the Democratic ticket to beat Larry Hogan?
Yeah. It's a great question. Definitely something that I've thought about, because honestly, I do actually think in a clown car of candidates, honestly, I think sometimes, on some of the issues, you'll see complete consensus. I sometimes jokingly talk about how there is violent agreement. But the truth is, for us, I think what distinguishes my campaign is a unique advantage come November. Because when you think about what happened in 2014, 296,000 Democrats failed to show up. And the majority of them were women, minorities, immigrants, and younger voters, 18 to 29. And so part of my strategy has, yes, been going to Democratic clubs, going to the pop-up clubs that have started after November 2016. But part of it has been to go to groups that have no Democratic, Republican affiliation at all. Because part of what we need to do is get folks who felt like they were not inspired to show up in 2014 to the polls. And that's where I think that we do have a real opportunity. At the same time, while Hogan won by 65,000 votes in 2014, and as I mentioned, nearly 300,000 Democrats failing to show up, you realize that a winning strategy could be just focusing on the Democrats. But this is where part of what I am focused on is taking advantage of that mobilization. Because there's a lot of independents and Republicans who feel like, given the he who shall not be named in the White House, that they feel like they don't have a party. And that's where if we run a campaign, a candidacy like mine, which is fiscally responsible, socially progressive, I think we have a way to pick up those folks as well. And the final piece I will mention is, for us, it is also a campaign that is unique geographically as well. We started this campaign in Garrett County, and we, over 3 days, ended in Ocean City. And that was not the first time I went up to Western Maryland or the Eastern Shore, and it was certainly not the last time. And this is where, yesterday I was here in Harford County for an iftar. I have been tirelessly crisscrossing the state because part of why we lost was we didn't show up. And when you see parts of our state where Hogan won by 60%, I saw the sign across the street where he's going to be active, and 90% of it is showing up. I have gone to forum after forum that have been for some of the congressional candidates where I'm the only gubernatorial candidate campaigning. And this is where, on the one hand, it's not personal how much traction we've gotten, in the sense that I don't even know if I needed to say a word, and I thought we had the crowd, because people are so excited to see a candidate who's shown up, because the truth is, if they're not there to ask for your vote, they're not going to be there to solve your problems. And that's where I think that we have an opportunity. If we show up, we can inspire voters to show up at the polls.
Hi, I got 2. So, general question, why debt-free specifically for HBCUs?
So we have provided free community college for all of our college. But for HBCUs, the reality is that as as a lawsuit has indicated, we have undercut the ability of our HBCUs to succeed in a range of ways. The truth is, if we provide this type of support, I do think in some ways it will be a remediation of historical discrimination and lack of funding.
Okay, second question. Can you talk a bit about the statistics regarding the benefits of women holding office?
Sure, and feel free to jump in as well. But this is where, and it's interesting because on the one hand, I do think that we have seen study after study in terms of boardrooms, courtrooms, classrooms, elected office that have shown that it is not just about representation, it is about outcomes. You see better healthcare, better education, lower incarceration rates. And yet, I remember when we rolled out our first campaign ad, if you haven't seen it, please do take a look. It's on the website, Krish for Maryland or krishforgovernor.com. I got a lot of fan mail and man mail. But the truth is, I got some women too who felt like me being a mom was inappropriate, but in any event, but it was interesting because I do think we still need to make the case. I think that part of what we have seen is that representation and diverse representation matters. And I mean that when it comes to gender, but also racial, geographical, socioeconomic. Having a range of experiences, opinions, perspective, I think is incredibly valuable. And that is where I think that we would have better legislation if it reflected the fact that Maryland is called America in miniature for a number of reasons. But part of that, I think, includes the fact that demographically, socioeconomically, we have incredible diversity. And this is where I do think having that show up in our electeds is critically important.
Question about the universal pre-K. If that does come to pass, how do you see that transition happening, and how is that going to affect the small businesses that are now, preschools in the communities?
Yeah. So I mean, this is where, for me, it's recognizing the fact that over about a third of Maryland 3- and 4-year-olds do not have access to pre-K, either because there's not a seat in a classroom available for them or financing. And so this is where I actually come at this, both having worked, two of our initiatives at the White House were focused on education, Reach Higher, as well as Let Girls Learn. But part of it is, the way I approach Let Girls Learn, to give you a concrete example, I took it from a seed of an idea to bringing in 7 agencies and $1 billion of government funding. And this is my private sector background, I always thought it's very important for us to leverage taxpayer dollars because that is how we get renewed faith from taxpayers who feel like, especially Democrats, don't serve as good fiduciary stewards of government funding. And that's, for me, where we could actually show leverage of government funding. So I brought in over 100 private partners and over $3 billion of private capital. Especially when it comes to pre-K, this is where we know it is one of the most strategic sound investments we can make. Meaning that for every dollar we invest, we get a $19 return on that investment between basically from kindergarten through 12th grade and then through 12th grade afterwards. Which is why when you look at Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, you have the Penn Foundation funding those programs. If you look at Boston, the Barr Foundation funds those programs. If you look at the Gates Foundation is active in supporting financing across our country. And yet none of those foundations are active here in Maryland. And this is where we need to find these kinds of public-private partnerships, because when we know it's a sound investment, we can actually make the business case for that kind of support. And that's where I think that there is an opportunity where, yes, the government will step in, but I actually believe that we could find private foundations to support this initiative.
So you would coalesce with the private
foundations.
Because the ability to do that in the public schools
does not. It's very
too
difficult.
much.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly right. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So when you make a partnership with a private corporation, to what extent do they have to put in their point of view? For example, Bill Gates had a lot of ideas about education, none of which I ever agreed with, and I was a teacher, a special ed teacher.
Yeah.
And so, how would you balance that, or look at that, or weigh that? Is the money the most important? How about the curriculum? What, because
Yeah.
everything costs. Everything costs something.
Yeah. So it is the way I approach a lot of our presidential initiatives, in the sense that I think it's incredibly important, and unfortunately I think politicians oftentimes get so bogged down in the infighting and bickering that they don't play the role that they should be in terms of convener. So part of what I always like to do is early on bring stakeholders to the table, because to the extent that you can get agreement, I think that's incredibly valuable. At the same time, I agree with you. Part of what I fear oftentimes is that some of our most important initiatives, because we are so cash-strapped, that we sell out these projects in terms of the design, the implementation, to private actors who don't have the know-how that sometimes government does. And so ultimately, the package that we present to be funded is one that I believe we all need to have sign off on. I don't want private actors, because they have, kind of fiduciary clout because they're financing it, designing a program that doesn't make sense for teachers and parents and for government officials. And so that's, to me, where I draw the line. There is no reason we would ever put forth regulations, requirements for a program that are based on that private actor's input if, as a government, as parents, as teachers, we don't agree with it.
Do you believe in vouchers?
It's a great question. I do not in the Boost program, just because 87% of that funding has gone to people who were already in private schools. As a daughter of public school teachers, as a product of Maryland Public Schools, the reality is we know that we are underfunded by about $3 billion. That's incredibly scarce funding. When it comes to charters, this is where I think that there is a worthwhile conversation having. But in terms of vouchers, certainly the way the program has been implemented, while I understand that in some cases there's discussions of supporting religious freedom, I think that it's not sensible in general, especially given the climate we have.
You mentioned small businesses. How do you make sure that whatever breaks or incentives that you offer to small businesses don't conflict with your other interests that obviously cost money, as far as like the universal pre-K you mentioned and various other education?
Yeah. So there's so we would not burden small businesses with the cost of universal pre-K, just to clarify that. I think there's a basic win-win in the sense that whether you're raising crops or capital in our state, I want it to be the easiest thing in the world to create jobs. Because the reality is that over half of Maryland jobs are created by small businesses. Having created a small business when I came out of the White House called Generation Impact LLC, I will tell you I have multiple graduate degrees from Yale and Oxford and Yale Law School. I don't think of myself as an idiot, but the entire process made me feel stupid. And so part of it is from start to finish, I do think the government can play a more proactive role in terms of supporting small businesses. Part of that is recognizing that it is an incredibly opaque process in terms of launching a small business. Oftentimes you see that small businesses are trying to do the right thing, but it's not clear exactly what that means because there are so many fines and fees and regulations, and it's not certain which apply and which don't. But part of it is also the government can roll out the red carpet or they can roll out red tape for small businesses. And oftentimes it is the latter rather than the former, which is why we do lose businesses to Virginia and Delaware. And so part of what I want to see is us being more helpful. I've been hung up on by the comptrollers and the Department of Assessments and Taxation because I couldn't navigate these websites. And this is where I do think government needs to be more customer friendly. Yes, there are, every now and again when it comes to, let's say, sick leave, for example, some tension with small businesses. But in general, I think we need to go after the consensus of where we can find that it is a win-win in terms of supporting small businesses and their growth and creating jobs, which obviously government wants to facilitate.
And I'm going to say we're going to just do like one or two more, and then I don't know what your timing is. I hope you would be able to stay. We have one more speaker who's going to go and present. We'll have some questions from. So if you're able to stay, that would be great. If you're not, we would understand. But so let's just do like one or two more questions.
And I was just going to circle back, I think, to the back half of his question was, how does your plan for business also align with your plan for increasing funding for schools and infrastructure?
Yeah, great question. So this is where I actually do think, again, that there is an intersection. Part of why I am a strong advocate of community colleges is because I believe that that is the intersection of our educational system and our economy. I talk to small business owners time and time again who have jobs that can't be filled. And part of it is that when we work together with community colleges, you see strong programming where the curriculum is actually designed for the jobs that exist in that region. And that's where I think that there is a win-win. I think sometimes we don't support our education system knowing that it is the pipeline of employees for these kinds of jobs.
What would you do as governor to impact mass incarceration and reduce the to impact the school-to-prison pipeline and reduce mass incarceration?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think many of us know that mass incarceration, mandatory minimum, zero tolerance, those do not work. And the sad reality is what you've seen from Governor Hogan is after doing nothing about skyrocketing crime, in parts of our state, this is one of his, what I call election year epiphanies, where all of a sudden he swoops in and he blames the judges for truth in sentencing and suggests that that's the issue. For me, it's about a few different things. First, in terms of the school-to-prison pipeline, this is something that I would constantly talk to both of my parents about, knowing that in Baltimore City, this was an ongoing problem. Part of it is you don't suspend 5 and 6-year-olds, realizing that that is not the strategy of how we try to remedy what is oftentimes an underlying problem that we don't get at the root of. Part of it is strengthening the mental, behavioral problem kind of solutions we have in terms of increasing counselors that are working with children. Part of it is supporting programs that we know work, like Operation Safe Kids, which Governor Hogan has cut entirely. My point is that if we support the funding that targets at-risk youth, if we recognize that it can't just be about those teachers in the classrooms, it's got to be about the parents and the community, we will prevent ourselves from prohibitive costs down the road, because when that child grows up or ends up in our incarceration system, we end up spending about $38,000 per year, right? And then the final piece of it is talking about treatment. Because many times we unfortunately operate in an industry of incarceration instead of what should be a public health paradigm. Only 1 in 10 people who need treatment get the treatment they deserve. And this is where I want us to make sure that we're providing treatment behind the walls, meaning in jails, in prisons, but also that we are working with law enforcement. In Baltimore, for example, you'll see some programs called Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion, LEAD, where if we work with law enforcement, people who aren't criminals, who are simply, I don't want to call them victims, but they are addicts. It's a health issue, are not put into the root of treatment. And that's where I just think that our monetary and our moral interests align, because if we give that person treatment, it would cost $5,000 to $10,000 compared with the $38,000 that I mentioned. And then the final piece, because I want to touch on this, and I know I will conclude, is opioids. This is where we know that this has been a crisis for decades. Unfortunately, we're not, part of why it has become a full-blown, headlines-grabbing issue is because it has spilled over into, demographics that are more vocal about this issue. But we know we need to stop talking about task force and recognize that we know what the solutions are. Part of it is pain management. We need to educate better prescribers and patients. When I came out of the hospital after having my daughter, though the doctors told me, don't drink caffeine, don't drink alcohol because of the potential risk, time and time again, they offered me Oxycontin, and I said no. When I came out of the hospital, they gave me 2 prescriptions for 45 pills of Oxycontin. Whoa. That's a problem. Yes. We know the vast majority of people who get addicted are addicted on valid prescriptions. Second, we need to crack down on pill mills. We need to make sure that we are, monitoring patients in a centralized computer system. So when a patient comes for a prescription, we know how many prescriptions they're getting. Third, we need to increase the 24/7 access to detox, stabilization, treatment facilities, because we know, particularly in our rural areas, this is where it dovetails into the bigger issue we see, which is that 80% of our rural areas are medically underserved. And that's where I think that there is a real synergy of how we can address this issue. You know, knowing that in Hartford County, the number of deaths has increased by 50% year on year. In Cecil County, it's increased by 100%. We've seen 14 counties in our state have significant increases in opioids, and this is where it is a crisis, but it has been a long-standing crisis. We know the solutions. I have met with folks in Baltimore City, in St. Mary's County, in Frederick. There are solutions that work. We need to fund them.